I think we'll start, everyone. Others can join us as the evening goes on. I'm conscious that everyone's using up valuable time of their own this evening from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and I sincerely thank you for all of that. Tonight we're hosting a webinar here in the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in conjunction with our colleagues in the Veterinary Council of Ireland and Animal Health Ireland to speak to you a little bit about some of the implications of Regulation 2019-6, which is a new veterinary medicines regulation being introduced at European level. It comes into effect on the 28th of January of next year, and it has particular implications for the veterinary profession, which is why we wanted to talk to you this evening. Tonight we're going to focus on the implications for prescribing of veterinary medicines, and next week we'll take a broader look at the rest of the regulation. We have, I think, a strong lineup tonight of presenters. I'll introduce them briefly. We have Caroline Garvin, who's a senior veterinary inspector here in the department. She is a recognised national expert in veterinary medicines and antimicrobial resistance. She is a member of the HPRA Advisory Committee on Veterinary Medicines and represents the department at a range of EU and international forums on veterinary medicines and AMR. She has been working collaboratively with the Department of Health and environmental colleagues to develop and implement INAP, which is Ireland's national action plan to address AMR. Next on the list, we have Niamh Muldoon, who is a registrar, the CEO of the Veterinary Council of Ireland, who I hope you're all registered with. It is the independent statutory body responsible for the regulation of the practice of veterinary medicine in Ireland. Niamh formerly worked with the Medical Council and took over as registrar of the VCI in early 2019. Since then, she has led the executive of the council in a number of important initiatives, including the publication of the renewed corporate strategy in 2019. Then we have Finola McCoy, who's going to speak to us about mastitis control. Finola has extensive experience in veterinary practices in Ireland, the UK and New Zealand. During this time, she's developed a keen interest in the dairy industry, gaining an invaluable insight into some of the challenges associated with herd expansion and disease control. She has a particular expertise in mastitis control, informed through research in Teagasc and Moore Park, and since 2013, Finola has been working with the AHI as Programme Manager for CellCheck. Then my colleague Peter Collins is an assistant principal here in the department with responsibility for veterinary medicine legislation, regulation and licensing of wholesalers and retailers, management of the National Residue Control Plan, and in terms of tonight, the development of the National Veterinary Prescription System. A few little points about housekeeping. Firstly, again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. I know it's not easy to take time out of your evening, so we really do appreciate it. And our challenge, I guess, is to deliver an informative and engaging programme of presentations for you. I know it's a common question with all these types of webinars, so all our presentations will be made available to attendees after the webinar. Tonight's webinar has been accredited by the VCI for 2 CVE points. The video of tonight's presentation will be available on the department's YouTube channel. And I will do my best to keep the programme on time tonight out of respect for all of you, and we'll aim to finish at 9 p.m. You can submit questions through the webinar and we will get to them at the end. I'd appreciate if asking a question you indicate who the question is being directed to. And for any questions we don't get to complete this evening or where we may not have the information available tonight, you can submit those and we will respond. And we'll do that by email. We also have a FAQ on the website related to the regulation, and we can update that to reflect any common questions that arise tonight. So a quick overview of the agenda. Why we're here. So really this regulation marks a once in a generation overhaul of the veterinary medicines regulations, and it applies to all aspects of veterinary medicines right from manufacturing through to the end use. It's 160 articles over 125 pages. I trust all of you haven't read every aspect of it. That's our job. And we have consulted widely over the last 2 years in relation to every aspect of the regulation, and we will continue to do that until the end of the year. And we are committed to complying with the regulation from January of 2022. Consultations have been led by this department, but the HPRA and VCI, who are also the competent authorities in Ireland responsible for veterinary medicine and the practice of veterinary medicine, have also consulted widely. All of the policy decisions have not yet been made, so there may be instances tonight where we will not have full clarity. And that's because we are really committed to full stakeholder engagement before policies are finalised. And that's really in keeping with the department's National Farmed Animal Health Strategy, where partnership is a key pillar of that. But we think it was important to engage with you at this point because there is quite a level of clarity related to the regulation, and they do come into effect in 9 months' time. And we can engage with you again later on in the year if that would be of value. As a food producing nation that exports 90% of what we produce, we really need to show leadership in complying with these regulations. We host international trade missions from all over the world every year. Mostly they're in person, obviously at the moment, or virtually, but they always take a keen interest in our food safety systems. And so that would include presentations on stuff like the National Residue Control Plan. So there's a really keen interest in the levels of security we have throughout the supply chain. Tonight we wanted to speak to you directly as practicing vets, as we recognise that you've got a critical role to do with these regulations and with the food safety in Ireland. Veterinary medicines are a very precious resource, and this is well recognised throughout the regulation. Niamh Muldoon, the Registrar of the VCI, always refers to the act of prescribing veterinary medicines as a privilege, and it is, but it also bears significant responsibility. The clear focus at European and national level is on preventative measures in animal health and welfare, and that really the prescribing and usage of medicines should only be when absolutely necessary. And we will talk to you a bit more about this as the evening goes on. So look, I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass you to our first presenter of the night, and that's Caroline Garvin.
Okay, good evening everybody, and I'm going to speak to you about the new regulations, specifically in the context of how they will impact on your ability to prescribe veterinary medicines from January 2022. So, as I said, from January 2022, the rules are going to change, and this new regulation will be binding in full in every member state, and there are limited areas of national discretion. In terms of the overall objective of this legislation, at the centre is continuing to ensure a high level of protection of animal health, animal welfare, the environment, and in particular, the safeguarding of public health. So in order to meet the objectives set out in these regulations, it seeks to promote greater availability of veterinary medicinal products, to create a more harmonised single market, and in terms of harmonisation of the single market, this is also in the context of taking into account the business needs of the veterinary pharmaceutical sector, driving innovation, whilst also guaranteeing the highest levels of public and animal health and environmental protection, as well as the development of the agricultural sector. There is, however, in this new regulation, in particular the veterinary medicines regulation, a very strong focus on antimicrobial resistance. And it's fair to say, in relation to addressing antimicrobial resistance, the EU has taken on a leadership role in making the EU a best practice region, and has really moved to shape the whole global agenda on AMR. AMR is accepted as a growing problem in the EU and worldwide, which affects the whole of society, and it's seen as requiring a coordinated intersectoral One Health response. So this legislation requires responsible prescribing in use of antimicrobials. And in terms of the focus at the European and indeed the national level, the drive behind this legislation is to reduce overall use of antimicrobials. And Colin referenced the whole focus on disease prevention in order to reduce this need, if you like, to use antimicrobials. And indeed, the new Farm to Fork strategy has set a very ambitious target of reducing overall sales of antimicrobials across the EU by 50% based on 2018 levels by 2030. So within a relatively short period. And this legislation, because of the focus on AMR, which is seen first and foremost as a public health concern, will have delegated regulations, other legislation, which will now restrict certain antimicrobials for human use. So will prevent them being used in the animal health sector. So just to give you a sense of the spirit of the legislation, and this is recital 47, so it's not legally binding, but it gives you a sense of the thinking behind this new legislation. And recital 47 refers to the risk to public and animal health if an antimicrobial is administered or used incorrectly. And so it has stated that in order to address this risk, they have require that antimicrobials are only available on foot of a veterinary prescription. Now that's currently the case, because when I talk about antimicrobials, I mean antibiotics. But I think this recital emphasises the important responsibility that vets have. And there is a statement there that says veterinarians have a key role in ensuring prudent use of antimicrobials. and that vets should only prescribe based on their antimicrobial resistance knowledge, their epidemiological and clinical knowledge, and understanding of risk factors for the animals. There's also a reference to respecting their professional code of conduct, and key to this is a reference to restricting the amount prescribed as only the amount required for treatment. So what this is saying, this is a recital, but it also carries forth into the legislation that from January 2022, vets will only be prescribing for therapeutic purposes, so for disease treatment, and only the amount that is required. So moving on, there's two particular articles in the legislation that I particularly want to reference from the aspect of what requirements are going to be met when you are prescribing next year. And the first one is Article 105, and this specifically relates to veterinary prescriptions. And this refers to antimicrobials in terms of metaphylactic use. And metaphylactic use is described in the regulation as administration to a group of animals where part of the group is already sick. And the aim is to treat the sick and in contact animals to control the spread of infection. So it's this group treatment where you're treating and to limit the spread to animals in contact with the sick animal. So what this regulation is saying, that if you wish to prescribe antimicrobials metaphylactically, this can only be done after disease diagnosis. The legislation also requires that you provide justification for any prescribing of antimicrobials, and particularly if they're being prescribed for this metaphylactic use or for prophylactic use. And prophylactic use is where there's no clinical signs at the time, so it's a preventative use of antimicrobials. This article also states that any prescription for any veterinary medicinal product, not just antimicrobials, if you're prescribing any medicine, it can only be issued after a clinical examination or proper assessment of the health status of the animal. Now, as to what constitutes a proper assessment, DAFM has consulted with the VCI to consider this matter further and to perhaps define what would meet the threshold of being a proper assessment. So that is in consultation at the moment. Moving on to other articles, well, the same article, but other items in the article. This article states that the quantity, when you prescribe, the quantity must be limited for the treatment of the disease present at that time. And this is across the board now for all veterinary medicines. But if you are prescribing an antimicrobial for either this metaphylactic or prophylactic use, the quantity must be limited only to the time to cover the period of risk. So again, the whole focus is on reducing the time period and the quantity of antimicrobials that are being prescribed. A big change will be the validity period of the prescription. Currently it's at 12 months, but from January of 2022, it will only be 5 days for antimicrobials. So what that means is the farmer or client will have 5 days to get the prescription dispensed from the time of its issue. There will also be EU-wide recognition of prescriptions for dispensing. Moving on then to Article 107, which is specifically focusing on the use of antimicrobials. There's a huge emphasis on this not to be used routinely. In fact, the article says shall, there's no should, it uses the word shall, so it means this is a specific requirement that antimicrobials shall not be used routinely, shall not be used to compensate for poor farm management or poor hygiene, shall not be used for promoting growth or increasing yield, and should not be used to compensate for inadequate animal husbandry. So really this is saying that you cannot rely on antimicrobials into the future instead of perhaps addressing underlying bad practices on the farm. And this is really, again, it's a move towards disease prevention and reducing overall use of antimicrobials. Then following on, in relation to prophylactic use, there's a definitive statement saying that prophylactic use is prohibited unless in exceptional circumstances. And it specifically states that it should only be prescribed for individual animals. So no prescribing for group treatment when it comes to prophylactic use, and only when the risk of infection is very high. So obviously one area of concern would be the area of dry cow therapy and what is going to happen in January 2022 and onwards. So what this is currently saying is that the routine treatment of all cows at drying off is no longer going to be permitted. Now, again, we have requested the Veterinary Council of Ireland to examine the whole area of prophylaxis and dry cow therapy so that we can consider what can be expected going forward that will meet the requirements of this new regulation. But certainly one requirement that will be there is to have individual cow information. Moving on to metaphylactic use, again, there is a focus that metaphylactic prescribing can only be done in exceptional circumstances, so not the norm, and where there is a high risk of spread of disease and no appropriate alternatives. The other area that's covered in the legislation, and it will be followed up with a delegated act, will be in relation to restricting certain categories of antimicrobials for human use only. And these will be the antimicrobials that are considered last line treatment in human healthcare. They are considered so important that in order to keep them effective, their use will be restricted to human use only. And these are commonly referred to as highest priority, critically important antimicrobials. And you may be aware that we already have developed a policy on the use of these critically important antimicrobials as part of our INAP stakeholder group. And we have already put in place guidance on how these should be used. The Commission will develop a list, and that will be available by January 2022, of what antimicrobials that you can no longer use in animal health. And the public consultation on that regulation is now on the Commission website if you wish to view it. But there are criteria that must be met in order to remove an antibiotic from veterinary medicine, because there is a huge cognizance and acceptance of the need to protect animal health and welfare also. So I just want to mention the change in route of supply for antiparasitics in food producing animals. The vast majority of them are currently sold through the LM route, but the HPRA decided in 2019 to establish a task force to review the method of supply of these medicines, and it decided that these medicines no longer met the criteria outlined in Article 34 of the legislation in order to allow them to remain as LM products, because there is evidence of the risk to animal health due to the development of antiparasitic resistance. So the HPRA has determined that these antiparasitics for food producing animals will only be available on foot of a veterinary prescription from January 2022. In terms of how it's going to play out in the field, if you like, we are again consulting with the Veterinary Council of Ireland to examine the area of a proper assessment and what would constitute a proper assessment with regard to prescribing of antiparasitics. And we're very much considering the development of a possible parasite control program and build this into meeting the requirements of the new regulation. In terms of the prescription validity for antiparasitics, this has yet to be determined. It is only the antimicrobials that have a prescription validity of 5 days, and that won't change. I'm just going to quickly reference medicated feed regulation. This is really of interest, I suppose, predominantly to people working in the pig sector, although we are aware of medicated feed in relation to being used in calves. This regulation will apply from the 28th of January 2022, as well as the veterinary meds. The difference is prophylactic use, preventative use of antimicrobials in medicated feed is strictly prohibited. There is no exceptional circumstance to allow it from 2022. Historically or currently, veterinary written directions outline how you incorporate antimicrobials into medicated feed. These will no longer exist from January of 2022. It will be by prescription. The validity period of prescriptions, again, will be 5 days if they're antimicrobials, and the duration of treatment of medicated feed has been restricted to a maximum of 2 weeks for antimicrobials, unless the SPC or the product authorization specifies differently. So that's really a quick overview of how the prescribing regime is going to change for veterinary practitioners coming into January of next year. I've just put up a quote, I suppose, from the European Commissioner for Health and Food Safety, particularly in relation to antimicrobial resistance, because this is a real key driver around this new legislation. And really the legislation outlines the actions required to address antimicrobial resistance, which includes strengthening the prudent use of antimicrobials, avoiding routine use, metaphylactic use, prophylactic use, and restricting the use of certain antimicrobials that are critically important in human health. So I suppose the other thing it outlines is the importance of the role of the veterinary profession going forward as the prescribers of these medicines. And I suppose in conclusion, the importance of the veterinary profession to provide leadership in this very challenging space. So thank you for your attention, and I'll hand back to Colin.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I omitted to introduce myself at the beginning, so I can do that now. My name is Colin Ford. I'm head of division here in the Department of Agriculture for Veterinary Medicine. So I will now pass you on to Niamh Muldoon, the Registrar of the Veterinary Council, who is going to elaborate a little bit more on some of their work in terms of considering proper assessment and clinical examination for the purpose of prescribing.
Perfect, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to knock off my video just so that you can see my slides. So, good evening. My hope is that you can all see my shared screen. So, I am appearing this evening as Registrar of the Veterinary Council to offer some updates on the Veterinary Council considerations in relation to the draft definitions of the terms contained in the Veterinary Medicine Regulations number 6 of 2019 EU. So the intention on the part of the Council is that some of these terms will be defined and included in our Code of Professional Conduct. So firstly, why the Veterinary Council? The Department of Agriculture have asked that the Veterinary Council would consider offering these definitions of the terms contained in the Veterinary Medicine Regulations and adding those to our Code of Professional Conduct. We know that our Code of Conduct is binding on all registrants, so all vets who discharge the privilege of prescribing registered with the VCI are bound by that code. The Veterinary Council is an independent statutory body. We're responsible for veterinary regulation, practice of veterinary medicine and veterinary nursing, and we act in the best interests of animal health and welfare and public health. Our vision is to be a trusted and effective veterinary regulator, and I've included our mission, which is to ensure standards of education and practice among the veterinary professions, enhance animal health and welfare to the benefit of society. I am including reference to our values, the values of the Veterinary Council, and the 6 strategic objectives outlined by the Council in our corporate strategy launched in December 2019. So by way of background, we know that the Veterinary Medicine Regulation is coming into force in January 22. The department have asked the Council to consider defining these terms contained in the regulation. And I suppose, why does that make sense? We at the Council are an independent statutory body. We regulate all of the practitioners that ultimately will be prescribing these medicines. And we know that national codes of conduct are referenced in the recitals. So recital 47 referenced in Caroline's presentation also. So how are the Council going about considering these definitions? The Legislation and Ethics Committee of the Council have given the matter some consideration, and the Council shared draft definitions currently under consideration back in December 2020. Last year, we shared those definitions at the INAP, the National Action Plan table and indeed at the antiparasitic stakeholder table. Now, I should say that nothing is set in stone yet. The Veterinary Council are in the process of meeting with and engaging with a lot of the stakeholders. The Council is very cognizant that these regulations carry an immense and significant amount of change. So we're keen to engage with all of the stakeholders in considering the definitions, which ultimately the Council will offer in the best interests of animal health and welfare and public health. So who have we been engaging with? We have been talking to the Irish Farmers Association, the Irish Creamery and Milk Suppliers Association, the Irish Cattle and Sheep Association, the Independent Licensed Merchants Association, Acorn, representative of licensed merchants, the Irish Pharmaceutical Union, the Veterinary Ireland, Teagasc, Irish Cooperative Society, the Agricultural Consultant Association, and the Health Products Regulatory Authority. So, in terms of the actual terms to be defined, these are all contained in Article 105. So, firstly, it is the term diagnosis of the infectious disease by a veterinarian. We are also looking at offering a definition or guidance in relation to what justification for a veterinary prescription should contain, and ultimately what is a clinical examination or any other proper assessment. So when we talk about by a veterinarian, what is the Council's current thinking? This means a veterinary practitioner registered with ourselves as the statutory body and the Veterinary Council, authorised to practice in Ireland and operating within the terms of the Animal Remedies Regulations and the definitions of animal under care as issued by the Veterinary Council. So what do we mean when we talk about these terms? We talk about a threshold of knowledge for any individual practitioner of an animal or a herd. And how do we say that that threshold of knowledge is reached before any individual discharges the privilege of prescribing, diagnosing and or prescribing for that animal or herd or flock? So firstly, the individual has to be responsible for the professional care of the animal, that's the individual or indeed the practice, have sufficient knowledge of the animal, herd or flock, be available for follow-up consultation or monitoring of any individual therapies prescribed or administered, and that the responsibility for the animal is real and not merely nominal. So in effect, having a client-patient practice relationship so that there is a holistic knowledge of the history and an understanding of the environment that any individual animal or herd is residing in. In terms of some of the actual terms to be defined, so diagnosis of the infectious disease. The Veterinary Council have sought not to reinvent the wheel, and we have taken a definition contained in the Saunders Comprehensive Veterinary Dictionary, no doubt familiar to you all, which talks about a diagnosis being performed by a vet based on information gleaned from a variety of sources. Excuse me. Those sources include findings from a physical exam, an interview with the owner or custodian, veterinary history of the patient and its cohorts, and or paraclinical findings. In terms of a clinical exam, this again is a definition slightly amended, taken from the Saunders Dictionary. An examination of a patient, including the physical examination by palpation, auscultation, percussion, examination of the environment, and if necessary, a clinico-pathical examination. We also include a reference to any exam, a requirement for any exam to be undertaken with reasonable care. In relation to any other proper assessment, the current draft definition states that any assessment may include, but is not limited to, a review of the clinical and management history of the animal, herd or flock, along with the relevant ancillary test results and or epidemiological investigations. The Council state that all veterinary advice and or treatment plans taken on foot of either a clinical or another assessment should optimise animal welfare outcomes, clinical success and public health protection. Again, we make reference to client-patient practice relationship. So in the absence of an immediate prior clinical examination, any other proper veterinary assessment is only possible within a current client-patient practice relationship and where the conditions of ethical veterinary practice have been met. The other term to be considered is justification for a veterinary prescription. And again, the current thinking on the part of the Council is that the justification will ultimately rest with the prescribing veterinary practitioner and should include contemporaneous medical records detailing that threshold of knowledge, which is founded upon an ongoing direct clinical contact with the animal or animals, ancillary test results, epidemiological investigations, and any other relevant interaction with the animal or their owner, as deemed appropriate at the clinical discretion of the individual veterinary practitioner. So again, the Council are keen to acknowledge standards of practice and the importance of the clinical discretion of the individual practitioner. In terms of where the Council travel from here, the next step is to finalise and approve the final draft definitions. This can only be done following the conclusion of all of our stakeholder meetings. Thereafter, the Council will consider offering specific guidance, firstly on dry cow therapies, and secondly on anthelmintics as an appendices to our code. Once the definitions have been finalised and approved, we will then liaise with some expert groups. So we'll liaise with the Animal Health Ireland technical working groups in relation to specific guidance submissions for both dry cow therapies and anthelmintics. And ultimately, all of these definitions will fit in our code of conduct. We are currently undertaking a review of that code of professional conduct. That review is ongoing. So aspects such as animals under your care will all be included in the context of that code of conduct. And ultimately, we will consult widely in relation to any amendments to the code later in the year with a view to having any updated code of professional conduct finalised in Q4 of this year. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to dealing with any questions later in the session. And I omitted to reference at the opening that I'm joined this evening by Owen Ryan, who will be known to many of you. He is an assistant professor in UCD. He is a member of the Veterinary Council of Ireland and, as many will know, holds a diploma awarded by the European College of Bovine Health Management. So Owen is here to ably assist in terms of some of the more technical veterinary questions. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Niamh. We will now move on to our next presentation, which is Lessons from Cell Check, Informing Prescribing Regime for Mastitis Control. And that's going to be from Finola McCoy, who's a Senior Programme Manager with Animal Health Ireland.
Thank you, Colin, and good evening, everybody. I trust that you can hear, and I think I have my camera off. You don't need to look at my mug. We'll concentrate on the slides. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. What I was asked to share were, I suppose, some ideas or learnings from Cell Check, and in terms of the application of that for prudent prescribing, specifically in relation to intramammary antibiotics, so in the context of mastitis control. When we talk, and I suppose just to take a moment, and the other speakers have already referred to this, but when we talk about responsible antibiotic use, I suppose is to put it into context of the why and the importance of it. That antimicrobial resistance, as we are all well aware, and I don't mean to kind of bang the drum again, but it is a growing problem. It's a significant problem. And if we really want to protect antibiotics so that they're effective for us, our children, and our children's children, we need to act now. And one of the ways that we can do that is by reducing our use of antibiotics so that we reduce the risk of AMR developing. One of the opportunities is to reduce our reliance on antibiotics, and by doing so, or by improving animal health. And certainly within Ireland, we've seen great progress in terms of udder health in the last decade. We've seen a reduction in the national bulk count SEC over the last 10 years. And I suppose it's important to explain and to comment that this would not be possible without collaboration. This has been an achievement of the industry as a whole. And when I say collaboration, I mean at an industry level, as reflected within the CellCheck implementation group. So we have the farm organisations, the processors, the service provider organisations and the government, and also at farm level. And many of you here tonight will be very familiar and aware of that collaboration, for example, through the CellCheck farmer workshops, where you've worked closely with the co-op advisor, the Teagasc advisors and the milk machine technicians to I suppose, to deliver solutions and education for farmers. And that's been, I suppose, it's that collaborative and multidisciplinary approach that will also help us continue to improve. When we look at the proportion of milk with an SEC under 200,000, we've seen an improvement since the start of data collection back in 2013, with some challenging plateauing in recent years. And I think that is an area that we should be concerned about, and I suppose perhaps sets the scene for some of what I talk about in terms of ongoing challenges. Again, putting a measure beside that, there is an agreed industry target that by 2020, 75% of milk supplied with an SEC of 200,000. As you can see, we've never quite achieved that. The figures which we're currently completing the analysis of for 2020 show that we're still at about 68% of the milk. So we've certainly made huge gains, and I think that has put us in a good position to I suppose to review or to be able to transition towards transition through this change in regulation, for example. But nonetheless, it will be challenging. And another area that we may need to consider are, I suppose, some of our practices around antimicrobial use. Caroline already outlined the expected change in terms of dry cow therapy. But equally, if we look at our current usage patterns as indicated by sales data, we can see that we have reduced our sales of dry cow therapy in recent years. But nevertheless, we still have evidence of high levels of usage. So essentially, blanket dry cow therapy, as one example of antimicrobial use, is the norm in Ireland and is something that is under the spotlight and that we need to work on. And I suppose the other area that we'll need to consider and look at, and again mentioned already, is the type of antibiotic that we use. So from the same sales data, what we're seeing is a small but consistent increasing proportion of dry cow antibiotics containing at least one HPCIA. So it's a small increase, but it's not the direction that we want to be going in. And I'm ever the optimist, and I suppose I see a lot of this as an opportunity, but that doesn't mean to say it's going to be easy. And while I certainly don't come from a hurling stronghold, I often think of this poster when I think of the challenge ahead. We're trying to navigate and transition, change both prescribing and usage patterns in relation, or practices in relation to our antibiotics, and at the same time protect the national udder health. We want to continue improving, if at all possible, or at the very least, we want to make sure that we don't lose the progress and the gains that have been made in recent years. So that is going to be a significant challenge. Some of the challenges that we see ahead, so supporting farms to move away from blanket dry cow therapy without having an impact on the udder health. In 2018, the CellCheck Technical Working Group published guidelines, what they called a selective drying off strategy. And this was producing guidelines to support these herds, along with the TASA Dry Cow Consult, which again was creating a framework for vets and their farmers to engage and develop selective drying off strategies. But the reality is, and we have been quite clear about this, both at the time and since, is that these guidelines and the current structure of the TASA Dry Cow Consult have been geared towards low-risk herds. In other words, herds that have many of the elements already in place to safely move away from blanket dry cow therapy. And yet it will still be challenging to ensure they do that safely and with minimal risk. In addition to that, we then have the high-risk herds, and we're all familiar with those that have poor mastitis control with or without underlying management issues. And the question is, how do we best support those? They won't be exempt from legislation that will apply to all herds in terms of how antibiotic is used. So, we need to consider what is achievable so that we are truly making progress and not just practicing selective dry cow therapy in name only or as lip service. Another practical challenge is currently the lack of individual cow information. So in 2019, 43% of herds were milk recording, and that was exactly the same in 2020. So we have a low proportion of herds at the moment that are generating, I suppose, measurable or verifiable individual cow information. But if we look, I suppose there are many positives too. And if we look at the science that's there, and if we look at best practice both here and internationally, I think there's lots that we can learn. If we look at one example, that, as I mentioned already, the TASA dry cow consults. These started in 2018 in a very small scale, and then ran again over the last 2 years. And the feedback from them, from both vets and farmers, and the rest of the industry as well, has been extremely positive. Some of the feedback, particularly from the initial couple of years of the service, has identified things, and these are some of the comments directly from the farmers themselves. So the areas that they considered very positive was that the vet was well prepared, that the homework done, and they were knowledgeable. They provided support, education, and direction. There was thorough analysis of the farm and the drying off system. And the selective strategy that was agreed actually improved and made management easier the following spring, which is something that we often underestimate. We don't maybe appreciate the knock-on benefits and impacts that it will have. And interestingly, farmers, as part what we consider as part of important as part of the dry cow consult, is for the vet to actually get into the parlour with the farmer and assist them in drying off a couple of cows, so that the vet has a very good understanding of what happens during the process and what the risks may be on that farm. Farmers saw this as being very positive, not as a big brother scenario. For many of them, it was actually a validation that they were doing a very good job. And on the other hand, if there were improvements or changes to be made, they were very open to that. And at least, you know, there were fresh eyes giving them feedback. The consults generally focused, and none of this will be a surprise, they focused on hygiene, early milk according, and dry cow housing. So some of the fundamentals to ensuring that we can prevent new infections over the dry period without depending or relying on antibiotic. And in terms of gaps, a couple of things, they were minimal, but a couple of things which are very resolvable. They would have liked someone to follow up with them in the spring, which I would completely agree with, because if we truly want to understand the success of our drying off strategy and the success of management over the dry period, then we need to actually get the data the following spring, analyse it, and I suppose understand and feedback the outcomes. Just looking at the perception, so these responses here are from a group from the first year of the consult, and as part of the consults, they were asked how do they feel about not giving antibiotic to cows that don't have any indication of infection. So in other words, for some, you know, is it a leap of faith, or do they feel ready? And interestingly, the most they didn't necessarily all start off confident, but for majority of the participants in that year, now that they had discussed it and involved a professional and had a good sounding board, they were reasonably confident. They understood the risks, but they felt confident that they could mitigate against them. Some were still nervous, but willing to try. And equally, some were only going to start when it was a necessity. And then finally, just looking at some of the actual quotes that came from the interviews with some of the farmers afterwards, and the question, do you think the consult is worthwhile? Resoundingly positive. And interestingly, a few that commented that even if they had to pay for it. So just to, I suppose, to explain for those that may not be familiar yet, the TASA service is funded under RTP funding. So the farmer does have the opportunity for 3 hours of the vet's time funded. So they don't have to pay for the TASA consult. But again, they recognise the value of it and felt it, you know, that it is something that they would consider paying for. So if, I suppose, as practitioners, you know, the question is, what should we be aiming for? What should we be striving for in terms of responsible prescribing? Are we doing enough now, or are there things that we can do more of? The CellCheck Technical Working Group has considered this in some detail, and they've looked at the science, the available science, but also international best practice. They've also, while there has been much reference, I suppose, from the VCI in relation to dry cow therapies, the TWG have also considered this in terms of in lactation prescribing. So again, are we doing enough in terms of how we prescribe antibiotic during lactation? And some of the, I suppose, the recommendations from the CellCheck TWG are as follows. So they believe that at animal level, and again, this is based on the science and the best practice, there should be individual assessment of specific animals with clinical or subclinical mastitis. This could be on the basis of clinical examination, but it may also be on the basis of individual animal information, particularly for subclinical cases. And this is probably more relevant for cases during lactation. There also needs to be ongoing assessment of all lactation animals. Ideally, milk according should be every 4 to 6 weeks, but a minimum of 6 per lactation. with one very close to drying off and one very soon after calving. And this is for the purposes of both informing our prescribing decisions in advance of drying off, but also monitoring the outcomes and providing the opportunity to have regular information throughout the year. So rather than having a void or a large vacuum in the middle of the year, for example. They also considered alternatives to milk recording. So take, for example, bacterial identification, be it culture or PCR. That is considered the gold standard in terms of identifying infection and therefore evidence for therapy. But the reality is it's not very practical. If it's achievable, it is a reasonable alternative, but we have to consider the practicalities around it. Another alternative considered was that of California mastitis testing, which may be a relatively crude screening of animals at a point in time, but may give a reasonable indicator on that day of evidence of infection or not. But we also need to consider, I suppose, the confidence of the prescriber prescribing on the basis of reported information, or should they actually carry out the California mastitis testing themselves? Again, these alternatives, while they may exist, they're really not, I suppose, practical or ideal as a long-term or an ongoing solution. If we want to have objective, verifiable information, we really need to have sufficient quantities of milk recording, which obviously, as we know, brings with it the multiple other farm benefits. There are also elements of herd level information, and again, Niamh has already alluded to many and described many of these within the VCI perspective. But to support that responsible prescribing, there needs to be a sophisticated understanding of the herd, the people, the facilities, the farm management. Article 107 mentions or discusses how antibiotics should not be used to compensate for poor management or husbandry. And as practitioners, we know that our engagement with the farmer and our knowledge of both the farm capacity and the farmer ability and capacity is really important in ensuring that antibiotic isn't being used as a solution for addressing underlying problems. Ideally, knowledge and oversight of all antibiotics prescribed and used on the farm, knowledge of the milk quality patterns on the farm, and access to accurate clinical mastitis records. Knowledge of the mastitis pathogen challenges on farm and resistance patterns. A detailed understanding of cell check resources, records of mastitis events, treatments, and importantly, which we often don't maybe have sight of, but it is a very important point, are the related outcomes. In other words, were treatments used? Were they successful or not? Because that information, those outcomes should influence how we prescribe in the future. It's part of the building the picture. And finally, a strong professional and working relationship between the vet and the other professional farm service providers. So in other words, the co-op advisor, the Teagasc, or the independent farm advisor, the milking machine technician, all of these individuals have a role to play when we're talking about holistic milk quality and animal health and welfare. So considering, I suppose, what are the implications or how do we apply this from the point in time when the regulations will change? The TWG has considered, I suppose, various scenarios and proposed what the possible actions or solutions may be. So what I want to bring you through is just a table that the TWG has put together. I don't really want to bombard you with content, but there is quite a lot of text within it. But what I've done is I suppose highlighted some of the key the key points in terms of the actions or the decisions that will be appropriate. So starting with low risk herds, in other words, herds that currently fit the criteria for the TASA dry cat consult. So they have evidence of good mastitis control and a low prevalence of infection. If they're milk recording, then we follow the current cell check dry cat strategy. So there are clear guidelines already proposed. But in addition to that, which is something that we also may need to consider, is the type of antibiotic that we select. Are we being as prudent as we possibly can? Could we align more, or do we need to align more with the recent EMA guidelines? In addition to that, mastitis control decisions, so ongoing support in terms of mastitis control. And it's also suggested by the TWG that this engagement in the planning for drying off or for the dry cow strategy is an opportunity to also sit down and review the treatment of in-lactation cases in the past year. So the idea of moving towards agreed treatment plans for mastitis, so that both we as prescribers and the farmer are very comfortable and familiar with what antibiotics are appropriate and are necessary for the majority of cases that may occur during the year, what kind of treatment outcomes are we getting? Are we actually selecting the right antibiotic? So I suppose reviewing and preparing for that. That's in a milk recording scenario. On the other hand, for low risk herds that may not be milk recording, what can a practitioner do? Well, as I mentioned already, an alternative, which may be just short term, that are individual milk culture results or an individual CMT carried out by the prescriber. And this would need, as mentioned already, there needs to be individual cow information. So we actually are suggesting that there needs to be this information from every single animal, which you might deem as impractical. And that may be the case. But if we're looking for even a temporary solution for herds that aren't yet milk recording, this may be feasible. Again, though, what the technical working group are recommending is that it's not necessarily a long-term solution, that the farmer should be required to immediately start whole herd milk recording within 6 months, or perhaps another nationally defined time-limited period. And that again comes back to some of the industry discussions that are essential around this. When we talk then about the higher risk herds, and you may notice that it starts to get more complex here. I haven't been able to fit both the prescribing decisions and the mastitis control decisions on the one slide because it's not as straightforward. We are dealing with higher risks. We're dealing with a higher proportion of animals that are likely to be infected. And we're also potentially dealing with underlying management issues that make the risk of new infection quite high. But again, where there is milk recording information, we either apply the cell check dry cow strategy as it is, or we may consider reducing the threshold for treatment. So in other words, the current recommendation is that if an animal has never gone over 100,000, she may be suitable for drying off with teat seal only. We might consider reducing that instead to 50,000 cells per mil. It's also been discussed, and we're also very familiar, and again, we've had some reference to it in terms of prophylactic use in exceptional cases and justifying that. And a suggestion from the TWG is that it may be necessary to consider blanket prescribing for another drying off season for these herds where the risk is just too great, but that it should also not be indefinite. It should be on condition that each of the mastitis control decisions are actually followed. So in other words, that the underlying problems are addressed and resolved, so that we're not in a situation where year after year the prescriber finds themselves needing to continue blanket prescribing that the exceptional case continues on an annual basis. Looking at the mastitis control decisions for those higher risk herds, again, we're talking about, I suppose, a genuine effort and structure around resolving issues. So there needs to be a detailed understanding of the problems on farm, appropriate planning, action planning, involvement of the other professionals and the skill sets that we need to bring in, and then follow up and review. Again, as I mentioned already, this engagement, both at the time of dry cow prescribing or subsequently through the year as part of the mastitis control, is an opportunity to review the treatments used and the success of those treatments for in lactation cases. When we take those high risk herds and look at the scenario where there is no milk recording, this is almost, I suppose, the perfect storm, if you like. Again, the individual milk culture results or an individual CMT carried out by the prescriber could be a short-term solution or a stopgap, if you like, in terms of individual cow information. But we still have the challenge then of, I suppose, of making prudent decisions in terms of which animals require treatment in a high-risk situation. Those same mastitis control decisions, so as I mentioned, the same reference to the suggestion that it may be necessary to view this as an exceptional case, but it should only be for a single season on condition that the mastitis control decisions are subsequently followed. And again, just like the lower risk herds where there's no milk recording, it's the view of the TWG that the farmer really should be required to start milk recording immediately and have that information, start generating that information so that we're not in the same situation 12 months later. Looking, I suppose, taking that same concept or principle, looking at the scenarios, but with in-lactation antibiotics, again, we have two scenarios as presented by the TWG. So we have a situation where the practitioner has knowledge of the general mastitis pathogens and the related resistance patterns on that farm, or they may not have that information. So if the mastitis pathogens are known, and these will only be known through appropriate sampling, so a combination of sampling of clinical cases, either fresh or frozen, but also sampling from a representative number of subclinical cases throughout the year. So we're actually getting an overall picture of the pathogen challenge during the year. And taking that information, again, referring back to the antibiotics on the EMA list, it's something I think that we need to give consideration to, the choice of antibiotic that we're making. And again, talking about the mastitis control decisions, considering the related outcomes from treatments. So having, it's one thing, and I know it's a challenge. I know, you know, as practitioners, and I've experienced the same, actually having accurate records is often challenging. And in addition to that, what we're striving for, what we're aiming for, is not just to have the records, but to actually have some of the outcomes recorded as well. And again, this idea of developing a treatment plan and reviewing that annually, so that during the year, if a farmer requires antibiotic for treating either a clinical or a subclinical case, that there is an agreement that we're all comfortable with in terms of what antibiotic can be prescribed or that they may have to use for an individual case. On the other hand, if there is no knowledge of the mastitis pathogens, the recommendation based on the best practice is that we should be starting with an antibiotic from the EMA category D, which is prudence. In other words, one of the, I suppose, the lower categories of antibiotics, unless there is evidence, and by evidence that means having the pathogen information and the resistance patterns, unless there is evidence of needing antibiotics from higher categories, but that really we should be starting with the basics in the absence of knowledge. And when I say basic, I mean the basic antibiotics. And again, once we're on that path, the next thing we need to do is start generating that information, acquiring that knowledge. And as I mentioned already, sampling protocols, so and sampling habits or patterns. So pre-treatment milk samples from clinical cases and taking milk samples from cows with a high SEC throughout the year, young and old, recent and chronic infections. I'm sure there are many elements of that as practitioners you kind of nod your head and say, yeah, I'm doing that. I'm comfortable with that. But there are probably also some elements that as individuals we know we could do better on. And I also recognize that there may be areas of that as well as a culture or a behavior change, there will also be a need for more training or more resources or tools. And these are the areas that the industry needs to look at in terms of supporting this change. But just in summary, moving away from blanket dry cow therapy is both an opportunity and a challenge. It's going to require personal responsibility, action and behavior change. It's also going to require a change in the landscape facilitated by industry action. Individual animal information is essential. Antibiotic can't be used prophylactically to compensate for management or husbandry challenges. And to ensure this, we need to have quality knowledge and experience of the farm and the farmer. And engaging and planning with farmers. So for example, developing treatment plans using the TASA dry cow consult has been shown to be effective and our tools and resources that I would like to see more of, and I would hope that we will be in a position to develop more of to support the industry. Thank you, and apologies if I've gone over time.
Hey folks, Joe, I don't know whether you're there. Column system I think has gone down for the moment. So I'm just now going to make a presentation on the new National Veterinary Prescription System. Yep, hi folks. I've made this presentation a number of times so far in the last few months, and I'm sure I've spoken to a few of you who are on the call this evening. So I just hope after this evening's presentation that most people have an idea and a sense of what we're hoping to achieve with the new National Veterinary Prescription System, and that you have a greater, clearer understanding of what the proposed system is likely to do. So the first slide I'll just quickly outline, which you all know the current practice in the landscape is the moment, is that the registered vet will undertake an examination or an assessment of the animal or animals, and it'll generate the script. They can do this in a number of ways. There's the current paper format, which is produced in triplicate, and it can be dispensed anywhere by including the vets. And as you know, one is retained by the vet, one is retained by the animal keeper, and one is retained by the dispenser. In 2017, the legislation was changed to allow for digital format, which introduced a lot of private software providers into the market, and where prescription can be developed and issued electronically once they're dispensed by that vet. On the MedFeed side of things, currently there's vet and written directives, which Caroline mentioned earlier on. Again, they're in paper format, which includes manufacturing mill details, which are recorded on the veterinary written directive. Again, these are in triplicate. They're manufactured and dispensed by the mill, medicines themselves, and then home mixers also get a premix dispensed for manufacture in line with what was written on the Veterinary Written Directive. So the new EU regulation changes which come about and the requirements that were in these legislations 29/16/4 and 6/4. There's no more veterinary written directives. They'll all be deemed as prescriptions. Legislation outlines exactly what the minimum details are required on a prescription and on the med feed prescriptions. The legislation also allows for member states to make additions to what those minimum requirements may be, and presently we're hoping to add 1 or 2 more details onto those scripts. Article 105 is the veterinary medicines legislation, and that's where the details of what the minimum details are for a prescription. And Article 16.6 and Annex 5 on the Medfeed regulations, where you'll find the details on those. Also, the EU Commission is hoping to introduce an implementing act shortly or in future, which may set a model format for how the prescription will look and what should be on it. So the new National Veterinary Prescription System. So what's led to the department to make the decision for this? The drivers that we have is it'll provide ease, as Caroline mentioned earlier on, the collection of antimicrobial data for under Article 57. There's a commitment for the department for Ireland member states to submit information on their antimicrobial usage. So with the information being held on all prescriptions being held on the National Veterinary Prescription System, it'll be easy for the department to have that information there ready for submission to the EU. It'll reduce the admin burden and replace the paper system which we have and provide overall efficiencies with the prescription process. It provides record keeping options for all actors, ease of record keeping for the veterinary practice, for the farmer and for the dispensers alike. And it'll also provide a greater choice for animal keepers and medicine dispensers. Once a script is saved, the idea is once a script is saved to the National Veterinary Prescription System and it hasn't been fully dispensed, then the animal keeper can get it dispensed anywhere, either a licensed merchant or a pharmacist. The overall benefits of the new system we see is providing evidence to improve our national policy development and animal welfare in the areas of antimicrobial resistance, reducing resistance overall with antiparasitics, and identify trends in illnesses and diseases around the country. Because we'll have all that information, we'll have all the information that's there of what's being currently prescribed, who's prescribing it, what medicines are being prescribed, for what type of animals, what species, what products are being used, what illnesses are occurring, and what area of the country they're occurring. So it'll really help with policy development. The system will also enhance with risk-based regulatory oversight. Again, we'll have all that oversight of all that information and will help us with risk-based inspections. And it'll also provide for the ability to allow for distance sales of medicines. That's an option under Article 104.2, which is under consideration at the moment. So what have we been doing so far on the development of the National Veterinary Prescription System? We've undertaken a significant number of stakeholder engagements today. We've spoken to a number of vet practices, Veterinary Council of Ireland, Veterinary Ireland itself, Progressive Veterinary Network. We've presented at regional veterinary meetings in Cork and Kerry, spoken to the licensed merchants, ILMA. We've spoken to pharmacies, feed mills and IGFA. We spoke to the HBRA regarding accessing medicines repository for the system. And we've spoken to 6-7, I think it's veterinary software packages suppliers at the moment. The intention with the system is not to replace any software packages that are out there at the moment. We're only going to produce a very minimal prescription module. We won't be producing any financial element or stock control systems at all with the system or administrative software. It's purely a prescription software, so it won't be replacing any of these software packages. And we've spoken to these suppliers, and we're engaging with them as to how we're going to interact and interface with them and their systems that are currently in play. Spoken also to the IFA and to ICOS. Further engagements obviously ongoing for the next year with farming bodies, the vets, and we're hoping to have focus groups later on the year as to how the system looks. And we're hoping to get input from yourselves. We're certainly looking for volunteers. On the right hand side here we see the ongoing business requirements. We're still gathering the requirements, started last September. Stakeholder consultation is ongoing. System design development has started. We have a new contractor which has just recently been engaged, so they're starting to work with us on the design and development, actual development of the system. We're hoping to undertake our user acceptance testing in October, November later this year, and hopefully have a rollout phase 1 in January 2022. When I say phase one is there's still an awful lot of information and how we're building the system, we're putting together. But we see primarily phase one will be just for food producing animals only. It won't include companion animals. So how do we see the system working? And we must remember again that it's only a prescription system. It's not another system. It's not competing with any other software provider that's out there at the moment. So what we'll see is the vet will undertake a proper assessment or clinical examination and diagnosis of the animals. The vet will log on to the National Veterinary Prescription either through a mobile app or a URL or portal that they may have themselves, or back when they go back to their veterinary practice, they can log on and upload the information to it, or again through their current software package and create the script. When they create the information on the current software package, it will send what's called an application program interface back into our system itself. So we're not replacing it. If you record a prescription on your system, it will tell us what that prescription is. There's no financial investment required by the vet whatsoever for the system. Prescription details are saved and transmitted to the National Veterinary Prescription into the cloud base itself. So they go up into the cloud and the prescriptions are sitting on the cloud. The farmer himself will receive an email or an SMS or a printed copy of the script where cases where there may not be any technical ability with a farmer. The animal keeper then themselves is free to take that email, the SMS or the printed copy to a dispensing agent if it hasn't been dispensed previously. The dispenser then themselves will log on to the portal, will enter the PIN number that's on the printed script, and they'll only be able to see that prescription itself, and they'll be able to then dispense or part dispense that information, that medicine. And the farmer and the vet will say once they're being dispensed, will receive a copy of that dispensed script electronically. So changes on the new VetMed prescription, I've only added in the differences here from what's currently on prescriptions. You'll see we'll be adding in the VCI registration number, and that'll be once the person logs onto a system, that'll automatically populate the system. We're hoping to collect the infection, the disease being treated or vaccinated against. The product active substances, which is a requirement under the regulations. So when you put in the product that select the product that you're going to use for the treatment, automatically the system will go off and look at the SPC and populate the active substances on the system. So that can be up to 3-4 different active substances. So that saves on time there. The pharmaceutical form and strength, quantity prescribed, number of packs and pack size. And these are all regulatory changes, they're not department requirements. If the product prescribed is under the cascade provision, then a tick box is selected that you're using it under the cascade. And if antimicrobial product is prescribed prophylactically or metaphylactically, then a tick box is required for yourself to say so, and a justification statement as to why you're using it. And if a HPCIA product similarly is being used, then indicated that culture and sensitivity test has been carried out. Again, as I say, we're trying to, in the yellow at the end there, we try and populate as much as possible the fields on the screen to make it as easy as possible to use the system. And again, this screen looks a little bit busy. I've left all the information that's now on the new MedFeed prescription. Previously, that was always handwritten. There wasn't any digital MedFeed prescriptions. Now we have all this information that's going to be required. And again, you'll see the last 3 or 4 are the same as what's on there in relation to using cascade products, using products metaphylactically, or using HCI products. Finally, our next engagements and what's currently happening at the moment. We're very conscious it's an ambitious project in a very short time frame, but we look forward to continuing the progressive engagement that we've had so far with all the stakeholders. So at the moment we're developing a communication strategy and plan to ensure that we're not missing any part of the stakeholders involved with the whole system. With continued stakeholder engagement on requirements gathering, that's ongoing for the next 4 or 5 months to make sure we have it collected and make sure the system will be optimized for most effect. We're hoping to establish veterinary focus groups on the prescriptions, the design and the workability of the prescriptions that we have. Similarly, we'll be doing that with the dispensers, just working on those and how the system will work for dispensers. We're talking to software providers engagement on systems integration and how that's going to work with them and trying to test that systems. We have ongoing animal keeper engagement, which is with the representative bodies, the IFA and so forth, ICMSA. User acceptance testing, we're hoping to undertake in Q3 later on in the year, in Q4. We'll be providing some training modules, sessions and webinars again in the future. And then we'll hopefully have, potentially we'll have pilot sites, which we hope to try late 2021 and then go live in January, the end of January 2022. So I'd just like to say thank you very much. And if anybody wants any more information from yourself, there's the email address mvps@agriculture.gov.ie. That's if you want more information or if you'd like to get involved with the project itself and help us out. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That brings to an end our series of presentations. So I might ask the presenters to throw on your webcams, please. And I will go through some of the questions then that have been brought forward by some of the attendees this evening. Caroline, I might start with you. There will be scenarios whereby, despite intense vaccination programs, thorough cleaning and disinfection between batches, and good pig flow, respiratory pathogens will become clinical, especially when ambient temperatures fluctuate. For us to easily treat the at-risk group, farmers need to invest much more in water delivery systems. Are there any plans to subsidise farmers to install such systems? And that question is from Alison Kerwin.
Okay, thanks, Colin. It's fair to say, you know, we're aware of the challenges to the pig sector, particularly in light of this new legislation. But really, we have the pig stakeholder forum, and we would see that as the place to discuss this and how the industry can work together on this issue. But it is certainly a challenge. Okay,
thanks, Caroline. One then, Peter, for the veterinary prescribing system. What about drugs that a vet dispenses during their calls out on farm? How will that interact with the veterinary prescribing system? Do these scripts need to be uploaded? And also, what is the time frame for uploading scripts?
Yeah, Colin, the idea would be that all prescriptions that have been, or all drugs that have been administered will be uploaded through a prescription system. At some stage, either it's the person's prescription system themselves back at the base that they're using the software provider, or else it's through our system that will come back and they'll upload the system. We are working on the timelines on this, because if they've been dispensable, then the timelines, hopefully, you know, there's no major rush on it. But if there's a medicine just been given once and then the prescription is written for a subsequent follow-on, we'd certainly hope that that prescription will be uploaded sooner rather than later for animal health and welfare issues. But we are looking at seeing how best we can do that.
I think one of the other aspects under my remit is the bovine TB program, and there's requirements there for vets to upload test information onto APS. So I think we can use that maybe as a benchmark in terms of timing for the prescriptions to be uploaded. Another question for you, Peter, from William Cashman. Will the administration of medicines be recorded in the electronic prescribing system?
When we say the administration of recordings, as to who's actually putting it up on the system?
At farm level or by whoever the medicine is prescribed to, I'm assuming.
Oh, no, it's purely a prescription system. It's not to do with the administration at all. So it's all about what is being prescribed by the vet. And that's not to do with administration. So even when it's being dispensed, we still don't know if that has been administered. That's not part of the process. The process is just about the prescriptions.
But Peter, will be capturing the prescribing will be uploaded, and then if someone else is dispensing the medicine, the dispensing of the medicine or part dispensing will also be uploaded onto the system. Yeah, the idea is even if the dispenser themselves then chooses a different product based on the active substance that are on it, or an alternative product maybe there, that will be what's recorded on the system as being dispensed, as distinct from what's being prescribed. You're correct, yeah. No, the dispenser will be recording what's being dispensed. Okay, and I think this could either be for Caroline or for Peter. Will the central antimicrobial database be developed for companion animals also at a later date? I say that's probably for myself, Colin. I would think, yeah, no, it is established. It is hoped, that over phase 2 or phase 3 that will be rolled out for companion animals as well. From Kevin McConnell, will there be financial support for complying with the NVPS for vets or for software and time involved? Well, certainly, you know, as we're saying, what we're thinking, it'll certainly be a free to wear basically service for anybody who wants to log on and use the system itself. But anybody who currently has software packages, we're working with those software companies. If there's 5 or 6, as I said, there's 6 or 7 sorry we've spoken to so far, you know, we'll be looking at how we can get the development of those systems to send the information to us. There will have to be changes to those systems currently based on the fact that
there are additional fields on those requirements of prescriptions, so they will have to be made. Those changes will have to be come in, irrespective of the MVPS system itself. But we're working on the transmission of data directly from us and back to them, say when the medicines is dispensed. So yes, we're currently working with the software companies, and we will be talking to them in financial terms as well.
Okay. I'm conscious maybe I should go to some other questions that were asked earlier. Caroline, I think this is for you from Lucy Chadwick. Could you comment on the likely route of sale of antiparasitic medicines for food-producing animals? Obviously, vets will have to prescribe, but will the sale of these now only be by veterinary practices or pharmacies and not co-ops or merchants? Or will they be able to sell if they receive a prescription?
The route of sale will stay as it is currently. So in other words, the co-ops and LM outlets will be able to supply once they have received a prescription.
Just to add to that point, Lucy, the department has established an antiparasitic resistance stakeholder group with all the stakeholders who are involved represented on that group. And one of the suggestions from that stakeholder group was to consider the possible decoupling of prescribing and dispensing, maybe for the whole medicines market or for specific categories of medicine. So we said we'd examine that and we'd present a synopsis of our findings at the next antiparasitic stakeholder group, which is scheduled for the middle of April. So hi, Niamh, can you explain how definitions of veterinary under my care can be made in the absence of a schedule indicating a required frequency of attending a farm or yard in a 12-month period? And that's from Danny Holmes.
Yes, thanks, Danny. So I suppose it's about there being a real and holistic knowledge and understanding of the animal, the herd, the farm, the husbandry and the environment. So how is that threshold of knowledge reached? It's within the confines of a client-patient practice relationship. So what practice has been given professional responsibility for the animal, for the herd, who is responsible for the follow-up evaluation of the therapy or treatment, who is available to provide 24/7 services, who has access to the history and the records in terms of the herd, the animal, and I suppose a knowledge, referenced in Finola's presentation, a knowledge of the farmer, the animal, the herd, the animal owner, the husbandry, the conditions and the environment. So I suppose that is how we say a threshold of knowledge is reached, which would then enable the informed diagnosis and prescribing of any treatment if required thereafter. I hope that addresses the question.
Next question from Charles Cosgrave. How do these new regulations apply to small animals only veterinary practices? Will I give that to Peter?
Regulations or the system, Colin?
The regulations, Peter.
I think it's the regulations overall.
Yeah, that's the question.
How do they affect?
I'd say that's more to me, Colin.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Caroline.
Just to say, although my presentation, Charles, mainly focused on I suppose the large animal side, the rules or the requirements are across the board, regardless of what practice you're in. So the rules about responsible use, prescribing after a clinical examination or proper assessment, the constraints around prophylactic, metaphylactic use, they hold across the board, regardless of what sector you're operating in.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Next question, I think for Peter from Bill Cashman. How is it ensured that medicine is given to the animals for which they are prescribed? So I guess tonight we have focused particularly on how the regulations affect vets, but obviously they have an impact for farmers, and farmers already are obliged to keep extensive records under the regulations. But Peter, do you want to elaborate on that? On
how, sorry, Colin, how it's going to?
How is it ensured, sorry, that the medicine is given to the animals for which they are prescribed?
Again, Colin, that's how it's, the system itself is about the prescription itself. It's not about the administration as to what's being used. It's the same as currently what happens if somebody wants to get a prescription somewhere else, they don't know whether it's being administered to the animal itself. So I'm not quite following the train of thought of that.
I think from a legal perspective, Peter, the point is at the prescribing level, we require the records to indicate which animals those medicines are required for. And then at the farm level, we also require the farmer to record what animals the medicine have been administered to. So we have record keeping at all elements of the chain. So in theory, those should match up. So I think maybe the answer to Bill's question is that we have an extensive investigation and inspection role here in the department, where we check records all the time at farm level and at practice level. We make sure that all those records correlate.
Yeah, the medicines book will still be there, Colin. So the farm, you know, we're not taking over the medicines book. The system will at some stage have a portal where the farmer will be able to go in to record and see what prescriptions he has been given, but it won't mention the administration of them. That'll be still down to the medicines book for the time being.
Next one for Caroline from Michael Gunn. How will the regulation affect antibiotic treatment and antiparasitic treatment of wild animals and non-food producing animals?
Well, again, it's the same criteria around reducing use and avoiding metaphylactic and prophylactic use, regardless of the species.
Okay. Next question is from Lucy Chadwick. It's a long one, so please have patience. Niamh, is undercare also encompassing OOH care, out of hours care, i.e. the prescribing vet or their own practice or nominated out of hours provider must also be able to provide 24/7, 365 care for these animals? Maybe go with that. There's other parts to it, but maybe we'll take it in chunks.
Yes, thanks for the question, Lucy. And yes, indeed. So if there is, for example, a practice that provides the lion's share of care, and if there is a secondary practice that offers out of hours care and support, then there would be a valid client-patient practice relationship with both practices. So it is not the case that any client-patient practice relationship is confined to one individual practice. It is about, I suppose, a real and holistic understanding and knowledge of that herd. So that might apply to more than one practice. So there can be more than one client-patient practice relationship attaching to any individual farm, animal or herd. Thank you.
Then Niamh, how will the recent consultation on telemedicine feed into the undercare definition?
So the recent televeterinary consultation informs the Code of Conduct review. So it helps the Legislation and Ethics Committee to consider all aspects of the code as part of the review, one aspect of which is veterinary telemedicine services. So the results of that consultation will feed into the considerations of the Legislation and Ethics Committee, which will ultimately give a recommendation to the Veterinary Council for the final inclusion in the code.
Thank you, Niamh. Peter, when will there be further decisions on distance selling of medicines under Article 1042?
At the moment, that's still very much under consideration. You know, Article 1042 allows for the introduction of internet sales once the member state has a secure system in place, and we see we certainly see the National Veterinary Prescription System as being that secure system in place to understand where the prescriptions are going. It may be appropriate for us to wait till that beds down for 1 or 2 years before we start looking at the internet sales. But at the moment, this sales at a distance, for the moment, it's still under consideration.
Just to add to that point, Peter, I think we are planning to discuss that at the next anti-parasitic stakeholder group in the middle of April, again, with all the stakeholders to take their views, whether they support that or not, because again, that's an element in the regulation, which is an option for member state. We're not mandated to do it, so it's at our discretion. Peter, on the electronic prescription, will the prescribed product be named by brand name or just active substances, which would give the farmer choice of brand name depending on where the product is dispensed?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Now, the regulations state that the product name needs to be added, but also active substances as well. So what we're planning on doing is to allow that the entry of the product name and the VPA, HPRA number or EMA number. The system will go off and look at the SPC and bring up the active substances and produce that on the script itself. And also there'll be an option for an alternative product to be entered at the end of the prescription as well. So then it'll be up to the dispenser or when the vet brings it to, the farmer brings his prescription to the dispenser to say, look, I'd like one of these, here's the active substance on it, or I'd like the alternative product. That option will be there for the farmer.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Then you're still on the spot, Peter. Is there a legal requirement for the inclusion of a diagnosis on the prescription? This may have implications with a vet practicing under current VCI regulations.
Well, I think the system is just the system as to when you start entering the prescription. Whether or not there's a legal basis for you to have to do a diagnosis of an animal is a separate thing. I think that you have to do the diagnosis on the animal anyway to write a prescription.
I don't know, Niamh, do you understand the question there, that there may be implications for a vet practicing under current VCI regulations?
No, I suppose any vet in practice is bound by our current code and is on our register. So I wonder, would the querist like to offer some more detail on that question, and I'll be a better place to answer.
Yeah, the system certainly won't be asking, you know, have you done a diagnosis? It'll be just expected that that has been done in that sense. You'll be asked that where the animals are under your care, all right, but it won't be sort of saying to you, you can't put this in because you haven't done a diagnosis.
I see a comment here from Conor Geraghty about the work pressures for vets, particularly in the springtime, working extremely long days, and it may not be feasible to go back to the office to upload prescriptions. So I don't know, Peter, do you want to comment on different options that there will be for uploading prescriptions? And I guess also we need to look at the timelines for which, it follows on from Rachel Brown's question earlier, how long we would require them between issuing the prescription when it must be uploaded.
Yeah, again, I suppose comes an awful lot of different scenarios that we're looking at in those areas. And we have up to 40, 45, 50 different scenarios that we've looked at from all the different actors in the whole system, as from the dispenser, the farmer to the vet, and looking at scenarios when somebody has a mobile phone, somebody does not have a mobile phone, they're out there busy on the system, they don't have Wi-Fi coverage, they do have coverage, how it can be all uploaded. And as Conor would say, there's instances where they're really busy, they may not get back till, they could go out on Monday, might not get back till Thursday, Friday. But we're finding most of the time those vets are mainly dispensing most of those medicines as well. So the issue of animal health on that is not there. But ultimately, we know that vets do go back and record all that information up onto their system. So again, once it's recorded on any in-house system, it'll be sent back to ourselves. Or if they don't have it at the moment, they can go back and just record it on our system.
And again, I think we can look to maybe what we have with the AHCS for TB testing, that there's a time-bound requirement to upload testing. So I think maybe we can use that as a steer for this sort of stuff. There's a question here from Kevin Corley, which I think may be for you, Caroline. I think it may be related to the 5-day validity period for antimicrobials for the prescriptions. Rhodococcus equi in foals where combined abscesses diameter is greater than 10 centimeters is potentially a big issue. The only current effective treatments are macrolides, which are usually prescribed for longer than 2 weeks.
And sorry, Colm, I'm not quite clear. What is the question specifically?
I'm assuming the question, I'm just assuming from the way it's phrased, I'm assuming it's related to the 5 days validity of a prescription for antimicrobials. So I guess it's just to clarify that the 5 days is only a time limit upon which the prescription must be dispensed, but it can be used for a longer period than that. When we refer to that timeline, it's when the prescription must be dispensed, not when it must be used by. I assume that that's a confusion at that point.
The other thing just to say to Kevin is that we're aware of the importance of the treatment of Rhodococcus equi in terms of the highest priority critically important antimicrobials, and there was a concern that that antibiotic might be restricted for human use only, and we have highlighted that to the Commission to ensure that there will be access to appropriate treatment for that specific condition in foals.
Peter, one more for you. I think we've had a lot of similar queries, I guess, from the farming organisations about, you know, you can have people who have different levels of comfort with technology. So how are we going to cater to vets who may have different levels of comfort with technology and dealing with the National Veterinary Prescribing System?
Well, that's part as well as Colm over the year. Hopefully we'll be getting out there and doing some training and doing a lot of webinar trainings. I probably expect we'll still be under some level 3 or level 4 restrictions, so we'll have to work on trying to have some training in certain areas maybe around the country to get people to use the systems, and just to encourage the people to use it. We'd say we are trying to make it as user friendly and as easy as possible to create a script, and that's why we'll be doing the focus groups as well with the vets, and we've already had a number of vets interested in sitting in those focus groups to try and ensure that the system is really smooth and really easy to use. So look, we have ongoing, anybody has problems, there will be a support channel, support line there for help.
Thanks, Peter. This one's for Caroline from Lisa Geraghty. Is it envisaged that every vet in the country, sorry, I've lost the question. Will be legally obliged to record antibiotic usage in time?
Will every vet be required to record antibiotic use?
In time.
I'm not quite sure. I mean, every vet has to prescribe, but not every vet won't always administer the antibiotic treatment.
Yeah. So I think, Caroline, we have a legal obligation to record antimicrobials usage, but I think at the moment we're kind of for us to record usage, we're maybe at the global level looking at prescribing level. Would that be correct?
Sorry, yes, yeah, no, I wasn't quite following the question. The Commission has declared it acceptable to submit prescribing data if we haven't got access to usage data, but obviously that's where we'd like down the line. I mean, we have it on the pig side now, but it's just such an undertaking across all sectors, so we would be submitting the prescribing data for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Peter, one for you, and I don't know if we have the answer to this from Conor Geraghty. What percentage of vets are using mobile prescribing technology at the moment?
That's a really good question, Colin, man. It's a pity we didn't think of that earlier on. I know there's a polling facility on the system, the webinar system. Would have been really useful to ask that question to all the vets there. I don't know whether but John is still on the call, and we might be able to set up a poll, but that would be really useful. We don't have that number. We've spoken to the veterinary software suppliers who didn't really engage with telling us the number of customers they have. So we haven't had that answer yet as to how many is actually around the country, how many are using it. So if Conor has any idea on it, it would be really useful to give us a hand on that, help on it. Certainly, if we have another webinar, that will be one question we will be asking, Colin.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Next question from Bill Cashman. What plans has the dairy industry to encourage the 50% of farms not milk recording currently to do so? I guess maybe I can take that one, Bill. Obviously, we're here to discuss the veterinary medicine regulations, and we don't represent the dairy industry, but I do know that a number of the co-ops, for their terms and conditions for suppliers for 2022, have stipulated that their suppliers must be milk recording, because I guess they've looked at the regulation and understand that for any vet to prescribe antimicrobials, which would include dry cow tubes, that cannot be done prophylactically, and it cannot be done for blanket dry cow therapy. It can't be done on a herd basis. It has to be done at individual animal level. And so the way to comply with that potentially, as Nola commented earlier, is to have milk recording. There are other options. I think milk recording is recognised as the most practical. I don't know, Caroline, do you want to come in on that point, or maybe Finola?
Yeah, no, I can add to that. I think that's a very valid question. And one of the things that I didn't mention within my presentation in the interest of time was that in the process of looking at what does prudent prescribing look like to a practitioner, when the TWG were looking at this, they also felt that you couldn't just ask that question in isolation. You also need to look at what are the external or the kind of the factors in the periphery that would influence the ability of a vet to prescribe prudently and to genuinely carry out responsible prescribing. And in that process, the TWG identified several national actions, so they're beyond our scope as practitioners, but acknowledging or recognizing some of the challenges and the limitations within the industry. And I think some of these elements, like what can we do collectively, what can we do collaboratively to motivate and facilitate and enable farmers to do more milk recording. If we believe in it that much, if we recognize the multiple values and benefits that it brings, and if we urgently need it as a practical decision tool, I think we really do as an industry need to even more put our heads together and figure out what's going to work and what's going to be effective. As Colin said, there are a couple of co-ops that have taken the initiative to build it into terms and conditions. In the past, there have been a couple of co-ops that have started to incentivize, but we also recognize that money's only part of the challenge. The hassle factor, the technology, cow identification, there are many practical obstacles for farmers. And I think it's not going to be one, I suppose it's not going to be one easy answer or solution. If it was, it'd be done by now probably. But it is going to require, I think, multiple levers. But it's a fundamental, I believe.
Okay, thank you, Finola. We'll find our next question. Peter, this is from John McCallion. What records will the farmer have to keep, if any? Is that decided?
John, again, the system itself will record and save the information on the prescription being given to the farmer, and obviously the farmer will get an SMS or he'll get an email as well if he has an email system, and he can also get a printout of that prescription. So there will be there's still a requirement for the farmer to hold prescription details themselves, but with the system, when you register with it, it will record all the prescriptions that you have been allocated and have got dispensed. So there will be a portal there for the farmer to be able to log on and see all the medicines that he has been given. So the prescriptions will be on the system as well. But the regulations themselves still say that the prescription will need to be retained by the farmer.
So I think, yeah, it's important to say that none of what we're discussing this evening takes away any of the obligations at farm level to have records available. I mean, we see this system as providing significant benefits at both vets and to farmers to aid their record keeping, to simplify things. For example, rather than a vet having to write out all the active substances of a medicine, that's going to be pre-populated. So we would hope that this would be seen as a useful tool that can make everyone's life a bit easier, but it does not take away any of the legal requirements at farm level for farmers to retain records, which obviously then will be subject to inspection by DAFM officials if they are the subject of an inspection.
Again, Colin, though, it's still very much in development phase, so there hasn't been 100%, nothing's been fully agreed on what it is, so there can be changes made to the system.
From Aidan McKenna, will an all-island basis be applied with this new system, which may be relevant to practices based in border areas? I guess I'll hand that one to you, Peter.
Yeah, Aidan, that's a really good question, and it's one that we're actually spent a couple of hours today even discussing. We are aware of, and we're trying to look at identifying solutions for where somebody lives right on the border and gets their medicine prescribed in the south, but their local pharmacy or LM is across the border, and they may go over there to get that medicine if it's an EU medicine, EU authorized medicine, and that can be dispensed because from 2022 all prescriptions are applicable across the EU. So once the medicine is authorized for EU use, then it can be dispensed in the north to that person on the basis of that prescription. But we may end up with prescriptions sitting on the system because those people across the north won't be having access to our system. So we're still trying to work on some solution for that.
I think the question for practices based in the border areas, I don't know, Niamh, do you want to comment on the requirements in order for a vet to issue a prescription in Ireland?
Yes, just to say, for anyone to prescribe here, you have to firstly be on our register and secondly associated with a practice premises in the Republic. So it is not a case that you will have a practitioner in the north not registered with the Veterinary Council or likely associated with a practice here. So that's the requirements from this side.
Yeah, and from the All Ireland perspective, maybe going back to Aidan's question on it, we're not rolling it out to the 6 counties as well at the moment. That's not envisaged in that sense.
Yeah. From Des Groom, will the availability of small animal antiparasitics be limited to vets or pharmacies and/or requiring a prescription? Caroline, do you want to comment on that?
Will the availability be limited to, sorry, Colin, for small animals?
Small animal antiparasitics be limited to vets or pharmacies and/or requiring a prescription? I think this is, the report in the HFRA was referring to food-producing animals. So just
yes, there'll be no change in relation to small animals, and the current route of supply and the route of sale for antiparasitics in small animals will not change.
And so, do they require a prescription, Caroline?
There's a mixture. Some of the stronger ones would, but the vast majority, as far as I'm aware, are LM, so can be supplied by vets, pharmacy, or retail outlets.
Okay. Peter, a question from Kate O'Dwyer. Will there be a paper option for the National Veterinary Prescribing System the same way as for the AHCS system?
Kate, another scenario that we've tried to encounter as we're trying to remove all paper prescriptions. That's the ultimate goal of the system, and to reduce that admin burden that's there. What the idea would be that if there are farmers who do not have the technological capability or capacity to receive an SMS or a digital email, that the vet would still be able to write a prescription for that person. Now, when the person presents that prescription, if it's undispensed, this prescription, into a pharmacy or a licensed merchant, that the person in the licensed merchants or pharmacist will be uploading that prescription up onto the system, and they'll mark it as dispensed.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Now from Seamus McManus, will there be financial support for culture and sensitivity testing, which is expensive in the context of food animal veterinary, and what is being done to encourage the farming community to engage with their vet on herd health? Caroline, do you want to take that one?
Will there be financial support for culture and susceptibility testing? Is that the question?
Yeah, and then what is being done to encourage the farming community to engage with their vet on herd health?
Well, at the moment, it isn't envisaged that there will be financial support for the testing. And I suppose the message in relation to engaging with better engagement with your vet on herd health, I mean, that's been coming from us for the last, in the context of INAP, for the last 3 years. It has been all promoting the idea of disease prevention and, you know, building your relationship and getting your vet on farm to have better knowledge. So we've been promoting that for the last 3 years, the value in terms of sustainability and economic impact of having more veterinary involvement to drive better animal health and welfare.
Okay, thank you.
And could I just add to that as well? I think even, you know, I think it might sound biased, but I certainly think the work of AHI over the last few years has also helped and facilitated that. I mean, if you look at you know, the BVD and other programs, also the funding, I suppose, from RDP in terms of the TASA consults and the TASA investigations. I think all of these are new elements that didn't exist 5-6 years ago, and they provide opportunities for vets and farmers to engage in a way that was previously difficult. Both parties may have recognised the value, but didn't necessarily know how to get started. And I think these have been effective in themselves, but also have been springboards for other, you know, for other activities and other engagements. The tools that have been developed as part of that as well. For example, the cell check dashboard that has just recently been developed and launched and will grow over time, I think are all mechanisms. You know, we've asked practitioners what do they need, and you know, to help them engage, and these are some of the things that we're trying to respond to. The knowledge transfer, again, another opportunity, and I think it's not just one single thing it's not flicking a switch. It's trying to look at how can we open those doors, how can we provide the skills, tools and the resources and help people to get on with it.
Okay, thank you, Finola. One from Cathal O'Connor. I don't know, maybe it might be for Caroline or for Owen. Will there be other diseases which will be identified that use of class B or C like Orequi? Also, what evidence is required when a bacterium sensitive to a lower class antibiotic do not respond on farm?
Okay, I might come in there first, if that's okay. The Rhodococcus equi example is sort of unusual in that the antibiotics of choice were listed as being restricted for human use only in the latest EMA guidance. So it's sort of a unique situation. It's not likely that other diseases will be identified. That's the answer on that one. And the evidence required in order to use these high priority, critically important antibiotics, we've designated the requirement around culture and susceptibility testing. So if you want to use them, they cannot be used as a first-line treatment, and the evidence to justify your use is based on the culture and susceptibility testing. So that's the criteria that allows you to move up the chain, if you like.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Peter, for the prescribing system, will vets only need to enter antibiotic and antiparasitic drugs, or do other classes of drugs need to be entered?
The idea is that all veterinary medicines will be entered on the system. Anything where a prescription is being written, it'll be for all medicines to be added to it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I see Ty Gavin. Many practice many practice software systems, the mobile apps for completing prescriptions are supplied at an extra cost. Many practices don't avail of these mobile systems, complete the prescriptions in paper format for compliance, and later record the information on software for billing in order, just trying to follow this on the screen. In order to work with an online prescribing system, will practices have to take the cost burden to upgrade as to allow integration of a new system?
Well, the idea is, Colin, if somebody doesn't have the mobile app software solution to it, I mean, the department solution will be there and the information will be uploaded directly into that. And there are ways that we're working with the software providers that we'll be providing the information back to them anyway in relation to the, but if somebody doesn't use the mobile app and they go back and enter it eventually into VetDrive, Telios, Joyce, Vetscope, wherever they are, that information, you know, put up on the system at whatever stage they get will be sent back into the MPS system at the same time. So it's not forced people to use ours, but the system the department has, and we're not in competition with these. As Colin said, like, because we are just a prescription module, it's a very small element to an awful lot of these software packages. That our system will be available for anybody just to log on or to download to their phones or to screen it back at the base.
Okay. Next one is from Daniel Byers. The legislation refers to harmonising the EU market to enhance availability. Do you foresee any medicine supply issues arising from a more open market? I don't know, Peter, do you want to talk a bit about our shortages protocol?
Well, do we see it having any do we see it having any issues? Comment about the shortages. Yeah, there is a new shortages protocol put in place between ourselves and the HPRA, that where there are shortages, and it's in conjunction with Veterinary Ireland and the IFA as well. We've been speaking about how to put together notifications for ourselves on shortage there is on the website. There's a shortages protocol for people to complete, and it's the same with the manufacturing authorization holders as well. If they're aware of shortages that are there, that we'll be notified directly either through the HPRA or via ourselves for those shortages. Does that fit with the answer, Colin?
I think so. I think that's one of the mechanisms we have in place to notify ourselves of any shortages. But do we see this regulation increasing the risk of any shortages? I think the answer to that is no. I don't see how that may happen. But obviously, maintaining a good supply of medicines to help support animal health and welfare in Ireland is something that we're very conscious of, and we're analysing the risk at all times. So that's that point, Daniel. Mairead Wallace-Pickett, has Veterinary Ireland agreed that its members will work with this prescribing system? I mean, that's a question for Veterinary Ireland. I can say that we have met with Veterinary Ireland. They have voiced some concerns, and I see some of their prominent members have questions here this evening, which we're reading through every one of them. We're not kind of choosing which questions to answer or not. So as we've said at the beginning, we're committed to stakeholder engagement. We'll continue to meet with all stakeholders, including Veterinary Ireland, and address any concerns that you may have. So I hope that addresses that point, but obviously I can't speak for Veterinary Ireland. Next question from Conor Geraghty. I think Kate might be referring to a generation of vets that are not comfortable with technology and may retire from practice rather than have this system foisted upon them and the associated destruction, time cost and software costs. I take that point, Conor, and I guess we have had some similar concerns from vets where it was considered that they may not be comfortable working with AHCS, but we have effectively moved that system now fully online, and every vet that I'm aware of in the country, maybe with the exception of less than a handful, are working fully with the system online. But again, we're happy to work with anybody who has any issues. We're keen to understand all of them and see how we can address them. Jerry O'Dowd has a point. The veterinary practitioner will need financial support to cover the extra costs incurred. This needs to be addressed at this stage and not ignored. And again, Jerry, I can only reiterate what we've commented upon this evening. How we envisage the system will work. We don't envisage that will result in extra costs, but again, as I said, we're happy to keep engaging with Veterinary Ireland and other stakeholders to understand that and see where we get to from there. From Conor Geraghty, will culture and sensitivity tests of cohorts in the herd suffice, or has each animal be treated in an outbreak to be tested separately? How will this apply to situations where the affected tissue can only be accessed on post-mortem exam? I don't know, Caroline, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Okay, Conor, thanks for the question. I mean, the first thing I want to say is the guidance document, the policy document on our HPCIAs that's indicating this requirement for culture susceptibility testing is a guidance document. So it's something that has been agreed, as you know, through the INAP committee. In terms of the actual question, just flicking back here on my phone, the answer is no. The answer is you won't have to test every animal in the cohort. What, you know, when you're doing to justify your use of a HPCIA. And the second question is situations where it can only be accessed by post-mortem. There is a provision that if on your veterinary expertise that you feel that you need to use this HPCIA, you don't have to wait for culture and susceptibility testing in an emergency situation. In order to protect animal health and welfare, you can go ahead and use the HPCIA, but there is the requirement to have the subsequent testing done, even if it is a post-mortem.
Next question from Robert Flav. Sorry, it's just moved on my screen fraction. How will practitioners overcome the low sensitivity, i.e. diagnosis power of bacterial cultures from milk samples? For example, we have a clinical case but culture negative. Who's best placed to take that one?
I'll take that one. I suppose, and again, going back to the TWG recommendations, the value and the real benefit of culture and susceptibility, yes, one element of it is treatment choice and treatment decisions, but the other, and probably even in greater value, is of understanding the herd pathogens. So rather than focusing purely on the individual animal, having and looking at more than one culture result. And that's the importance of, you know, why we emphasize the need for having a selection of samples. So yes, we'll have individual clinical cases, you know, commonly where we may not culture a pathogen from that particular animal, but with broader and a build-up of information and accumulating information and knowledge over time, we have a much better understanding of what are the common pathogens within that herd and the likely, you know, the likely challenges to inform our decisions in terms of management, but also treatment.
Thank you, Finola. Next one.
Can I just come in?
Of course, yeah, Caroline, yeah.
Sorry, just to make a comment that we are, the department is working with AHI around proficiency testing and, you know, the whole identification of pathogens, and we're looking to develop maybe an accreditation system for all laboratories across the country, but we're starting with the whole area of milk culture. So we are aware of possible deficiencies in the diagnoses at culture level. So it is something that we're working on jointly with AHI and our own laboratories.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm conscious, I did promise we'd finish by 9 o'clock. We've now 3 minutes to go, so I might 2 more questions. I think we'll leave it, if that's okay. So question from Emer McGrath: if this antimicrobial usage data is required to be collected by the department, then surely the department is pushing its work. Sorry, the screen has moved on me. It's pushing its work onto vets. Vets already do work on behalf of the department, TB testing, etc., and are paid for their time and work. Why should vets not be compensated for carrying out administrative work on behalf of the department? Most vets will agree that they find their current prescribing system most practical. This system will involve more time and work for the vet. So I don't know, Caroline, do you want to take an element of that, and Peter, perhaps?
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose maybe Peter, do you want to comment first on the time and work for the vet aspect?
Yeah, certainly what Emer mentions there, and we're conscious of it. Most vets will agree that they find their current prescribing system most practical. Again, as we mentioned earlier on the presentation and through a lot of the questions there at Emer, you know, we're not replacing your current software package. You'll still enter the same information in your software package. You won't even know our system is there, in that sense that your software package will send the information straight to ourselves. So there won't be the need for yourself to actually change that information that's there. But there will be a requirement for those software packages based on the regulations, and not what the department are requiring. It's what the regulations require of the exact details that needs to be on the prescription.
And just to add to that, the reason that the department has to collect this data, the reason that the European Commission require this data, is to drive improvement around the use of antimicrobials. So to identify best practice and maybe not so best practice, to drive change. So in other words, to reduce the use of antimicrobials, to deliver for the greater good to address antimicrobial resistance. So this data is key, and as Peter has outlined, we are working very closely with the sector to try and ensure that there's minimal inconvenience and administrative burden.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to have one last question, but as I said at the outset, when we were referring to the housekeeping, we will answer all questions after the meeting, and for ones where we see a significant common interest, we can update our FAQs on the website. Sorry, I'm trying to find. Is there, from Liam Anderson Porter, is there going to be a huge jump in the number of samples in general being sent for culture and sensitivity, and where is the extra lab capacity going to come from? Caroline, do you want to take that?
Yes, I suppose the reality is that there will be, if you were requiring to use the HPCIAs. That's really where this requirement is targeted. But I suppose really to justify use of antimicrobials, it is very helpful to have the culture and susceptibility testing done. But we are focusing more in terms of whether you need to use a HPCIA or not, that you would use this culture and susceptibility testing. Was there a second part to that question, Colin? Where is the lab capacity coming from? Well, I suppose we see if there's a need for this in the sector, that private labs perhaps will increase their capacity to meet the demand. So we see the market forces driving the increase in capacity.
And just to add there, as Caroline mentioned earlier, in terms of the development, you know, looking at developing lab capacity and capabilities, one of the preliminary pieces of work that we're at the moment is trying to gather that information. So even questionnaires with the labs, the private labs currently in the market, in terms of being able to quantify their capacity and what is the scope for expansion, because they're very practical questions. You know, we need to know what we're dealing with now and what the capacity for future is, and you know, and can we respond to the likely increased demand?
Okay, it's 9:02. We still have over 400 people on the call, and I want to thank everyone sincerely for all of your time. It's a huge chunk of your time in the evening to give to us, and we really do appreciate that. I hope you found the session informative. As I said, we will come back with all the with answers to all of your questions, and if you have any, if tonight prompts any more questions, we're more than happy to field those here in the department and respond. And we are also open to hosting further webinars before the regulations come into effect, if that would be useful. And as I said at the beginning, or sorry, throughout the session, we are committed to continuing our engagement with stakeholders, and that will obviously include the veterinary representative bodies such as Veterinary Ireland and the Progressive Veterinary Network. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you all have a lovely evening and a good Easter break.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.